All right. Good morning, everyone. Happy last commission meeting of the year. And Commissioner Schaefer's last meeting with us. It's kind of bittersweet. Yeah. So it doesn't mean we're going to give you extra time to talk, but I'm just joking. We will if you have lots to say. But yeah, well, it's going to be as I said, I think bittersweet is probably the best word for it. So,
Thanks, Mary.
yeah, you're welcome. It's been a joy to serve with you. Yeah, I remember, I don't know if everyone remembers this, but Commissioner Schaefer and I ran for City Commission the very first year together, and we actually participated in a couple debates, so this was back in '05, and so I got to know Commissioner Schaefer when he was a candidate and hear about his journey and his story and his life and his passion, and then he ran again and won 4 years later.
Yeah.
So, anyway. We're getting old, Commissioner.
I still have that photo, yeah. You look the same, but I look older.
I don't know about that. But anyway.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, so let's get started today. So Commissioners, we have a number of items before us on Committee of the Whole, several that are action items, a few that are updates and discussion items where I'm hopeful that we can give some direction to city staff. But to start us off this morning, I'm going to ask our chief, our police chief, Rahinsky, to come forward and give us an update about the incident that occurred that we found out about last Tuesday and that many of us have had multiple conversations about over this last week. It's received a lot of media attention, but I know all of us have been in conversations with community members about it. Many of us have publicly said, as the chief said, that we know that there's work that we need to do, and we're committed to continuing to work with the community to improve. So I'm just going to turn it over to the chief, ask for an update. I've asked that he also come tonight to our evening meeting to provide an update both to this morning at COW, but also tonight at our 7 p.m. meeting at the beginning of our meeting. So Chief, thank you for being here and for providing this update.
Good morning, Mayor and Commissioners. So what I was asked to do by the city manager was twofold. One was to give a very concise update as to what was covered at our last meeting with 21st Century Policing, with the task force and the community meeting. I know that Mayor, yourself, and Commissioners were in attendance, but I also know that not everyone had a chance to hear everything that was said. So I'm going to go through this very quickly, and at the same time, it's an opportunity for me to interject and share some of what has transpired in the last week and how it relates directly to some of the steps that we're taking. So as you know, the group that we've asked to come in is looking at the police department and police and community relations through the lens of the DOJ report that was authored in part by some of the people who were serving on that task force. Amongst the six pillars, the one that we concentrated on at our last meeting was building trust and legitimacy. So in regards to building trust and legitimacy, it's recognized in police and community relations that the task force will focus on the need to ensure that our agency better reflects the diversity of the community we serve. Law enforcement obviously fulfills a lot of different roles in the community. We are the most visible form of government. We're oftentimes the only contact that individuals or residents will have with a direct representative of city government. So it's important that we reflect the communities we serve. We're looking not only to reflect the community, not just in terms of race and gender, but also in other characteristics such as religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, language ability, background, and experience. Directly relating this to the issue that occurred last week, trust is essential to diffusing tensions, solving crimes, and creating a system in which residents view law enforcement as fair and just. At the end of the day, if we are not viewed as legitimate and having the best interest of the community we serve at heart, it makes our job all the more difficult. Strained relations and a lack of trust with law enforcement may deter individuals that we're trying to recruit to law enforcement from looking to join what we're trying to accomplish. So some of the things that we're working on, Boys and Girls Club is a continuing effort. Last night we took our first Pathways to Policing graduate group that consisted of a dozen members. Last night was the final meeting. We took them out to dinner and celebrated an opportunity for them to be more exposed to relationships with officers. Impact is the police task force that we serve that will consist of high school members from throughout Grand Rapids that will serve as an advisory committee to myself and our leadership team. The Police Explorer Program and Youth Police Academy have both been initiatives that we've been undertaking now for the better part of 2 years. This is the paradigm that we've referred to in terms of recruiting for diversity, how it starts with these relationships and ultimately ends with us hiring qualified candidates from within the city and diverse backgrounds. So the goals, short-term, improve relationships, mid-term, build trust, and long-term, a police department that mirrors the community it serves, and a collaborative effort between the police department and the community to improve neighborhood safety. So in regards to what happened last week, some of the things that we've undertaken is immediately after the interview that would air a week ago yesterday, we had an opportunity to meet with family members and NAACP, discuss what occurred. We also had an opportunity to meet with the officers who were directly involved. And the officers had a chance to speak with family members as well. That's a relationship that we hope to continue, but we're going to do so at the pace and as the family members identify as being most appropriate. Some of the other things that we're doing is looking at bringing in some additional training in terms of de-escalation techniques. We've had ongoing conversations with Grand Rapids area pastors. We've discussed this issue with the Urban League. We've been in contact with individuals from within the department, hitting every roll call, hitting the detectives. It's important. We recognize we've got multiple stakeholders in this issue. And at the end of the day, the message that we were trying to convey consistently was when we have policies and procedures that we follow that may result in an outcome that is less than ideal, then the issue or the challenge doesn't necessarily lie with the individual officers. It lies with the system. It lies with what we can modify to ensure more equitable outcomes or outcomes that we can deem a success. I was asked, or I've been asking, and it's somewhat a rhetorical question, I don't think anyone would deem that episode as a success. So when we look at that, what do we need to modify to ensure at the end of situations like that collectively as a community, as a police department, we feel better about what occurred? So that's the conversation we're in the midst of. Adding community members to the Public Safety Task Force will go a long way to helping us get their input. Having the 21st Century Policing Task Force look at our policies and procedures. I've been in contact with them. We've been supplying them with copies of the policies that are most relevant to what occurred and most relevant to community relations. So we're getting that continual input. So we're certainly not going to be anything other than transparent. We're listening, and at this point I think it's important that the community knows we hear their voice, and we've got progress to make. This is our most recent non-sworn academy class that we're very proud of. And I know you've seen this picture before, but it represents some success. And I think it's important as a community and as a department that we share those successes, celebrate those successes. So getting ready to close up, one of the final portions of the meeting that we had with that group was to take a look at our service areas. We've got 5 service areas. If you look at the calls for the breakdown for calls for service, central, north, south, east, west, and the non-dispatched, they're very comparable. So this, what you're looking at now, is the central service area, which is our most recent one. It was the one that was carved out to be more responsive to the central business district, the growing area. It's the smallest geographically, so calls for service, it receives the smallest percentage. But in terms of crime, it accounts for 10% of the Part 1 offenses, which are the more serious offenses, and 11% of the Part 2 offenses. Here you have the north service area. It's nearly 30% of the city population with 57,000 residents. In terms of total square miles, it's 35% of the city, 15 square miles. Persons per square miles is one of the things we were looking at in terms of deployment, 3,700 people. Calls for service, about 20%. Offenses, 20% for both Part 1 and Part 2. Let me go back to the staffing because that was one of the conversation points. So the central service area, 9 police officers, 3 community policing specialists. North, North, 25 officers, 3 community policing specialists. South service area, 28 police officers, 6 police specialists. Calls for service, about 22%. Nearly 23% of the Part 1 offenses and 26% of the Part 2 offenses. East service area, nearly 30% of the city in terms of population, 26% of it in terms of total land area, 24 officers and 3 community policing specialists. Part 1 offenses, 26%, and Part 2 offenses, 23%. So you can see a theme here. The areas, with the exception of the central business district, central service area, are really very comparable in terms of resources and calls for service, as well as Part 1 and Part 2 crimes. West service area, 20% of the city with a 40,000 population, 30% of the calls for service, 20% of the Part 1 offenses, and 20% of the Part 2 offenses. So that was the information that was shared with the task force. Part of the discussion regarding resources and deployment dealt with how communities want to be policed, how they feel they're being policed, perception versus reality, calls for service in terms of how officers are deployed, how we're utilizing intelligence in terms of crime analysis and making sure that officers are where they need to be in terms of where the hot spots are. So that's a brief overview of what was shared with the group, a brief overview of where we are in terms of the issue that occurred on the 6th, and I'll answer any questions that you may have.
Colleagues, questions? Commissioner Lanier?
Thanks, Chief, for that presentation. I have a question about officers, I don't know what the right word is, but specialty officers like SWAT or what do you all call it?
SRT, Special Response Team.
And the community police officers, how do they fit into the chart that you just, those 3 or 4 charts that you just presented?
So the community policing officers were captured in those charts, and we'll make these available both electronically and hard copy for commissioners and the public as well. So the community policing specialists, their numbers were captured in those numbers that were presented. SRT was not. Okay. SRT we deployed for the most part in the evenings in response to particular crime trends. So it's kind of a more robust,
as needed basis. So
yes,
they can be anywhere at any point.
That's well said, on an as needed basis.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner?
Yes, thank you, Chief, for this update. We really do appreciate it because obviously this is an issue that is on so many people's minds. So I understand that you'll come tonight as well.
I will, and again, this segues, I believe it segues well with the issues we're currently facing, because 21st Century Policing, the task force was empowered to look at these types of issues, to hear from community, to look at policy, look at procedure, see what we're doing well, see what we can potentially improve upon. The last thing we want to do is be insular as a police department. We want to be open to criticism and change and continue to improve.
Well, and I know that you know this, that there are many people that are stepping up to try to provide solutions. We enjoyed last week when or was it the week before already?
2 weeks.
2 weeks ago when we had the safe presentations, and we appreciate the fact that Captain Collard was with us. And there are many others that are coming our way that are saying, we are here to work with the police department. So that's gratifying. And I think, too, that it'll be important that we get these kind of updates, not when there's been a crisis, but we have a regular update so that the public is well informed all along about what the task force is achieving. So thank you for today's.
So our next task force meeting is in January, and then the next public meeting is March 7th. So we encourage members of the community to come out. Obviously, the more people who come, the better informed they'll be, but we'll also make efforts to make sure we put it on Facebook Live, that we record it and broadcast it as well.
Chief, to follow up on that, two things. One is I feel like we didn't get the word out early enough for our last one. So some people I heard from afterwards said, I wish I would have known about this. I really wanted to be there. So can we get that date and location and time out as soon as possible so that people can get it on their schedules early and obviously know about it? And I'll just trust that you can work on that with city staff. And then my other question is to follow up with what Commissioner Kelly said. I think all of us have heard from community members who really want to be a part of the solution. Have you thought about a pathway or a mechanism for that, where people maybe who haven't been engaged in improving community police relations, who are now really interested, a way for them to get involved, or not just learn about what we're doing, but also give them an opportunity to share their ideas?
So we are having those conversations, Mayor. I think that the timeliness couldn't be better, but I also think that I want to make sure that we direct some of the energies into some of the existing opportunities, because we've got, whether it's the CRC, which I had an opportunity to talk to about the incident, or 21st Century Policing, which is now going to delve a little deeper in the policies as it applies to these types of encounters. But to your point, yes, we need to identify, and we're looking to identify additional opportunities for people to become involved. So we've been in contact with the Grand Rapids area pastors. We've been invited to meet with them, and that's a continuing relationship that we have with their executive committee, conversations with the NAACP, the Urban League, West Michigan Hispanic Association. But to your point, yes, we want to make sure that the people who aren't necessarily affiliated with a group still have an opportunity and a mechanism to be heard.
Okay. So when we get that request or interest from someone, what do you recommend? That they, I'm willing to meet with folks, but I also think it's important that they connect with, as I said, learn about what we're doing. If they're not affiliated with one of the organizations or groups that we're working with, how can they connect?
So I think the best way to connect is through the police department contacting my office.
Okay.
To your point, while I'm certainly available, I think there is value in them speaking to the officer who patrols their neighborhood, to their particular community policing specialist, to their captain. Because I think what they'll see is the same sense of the desire to address some of these issues, regardless of the rank, regardless of where an individual is within the department. So in an effort for them to really be heard, I'd ask them to contact our office. We'll put them in touch with either myself, their community service officer, or the area captain, and make sure that that meeting takes place.
Great. Thank you. That's helpful. All right, others? Commissioner Jones?
Yep. Thank you, Chief, for the presentation on this morning. If you would be kind enough to send that to us as soon as possible, I'd love to have an opportunity to digest what you presented. So.
I'll do that as soon as we conclude here. Yes, it is a lot of information, and I appreciate the opportunity. I'll be here this evening as well to answer any questions that you may have after you've had a chance to digest it better.
Great. And then, Chief, I know we have a public safety meeting, and on that agenda is an update on the fire department. But I'm thinking because of just this incident, there may be questions by members of the Public Safety Committee. So I don't know if you were planning to attend that or not.
Sure. I'll make myself available specifically to answer any questions that may come up.
I'll look to my colleagues who serve on public safety, but I think that would probably be helpful just in case
Certainly.
questions are raised.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Great.
Chief Lyman is here. Does he
Hi,
have
Chief.
capacity in his presentation too? All right.
All right,
We
Thank
can
perfect.
finish a little early.
Yeah, I noticed that the last couple times that y'all were out early, so, I'll just add to your agenda. Not like Tuesdays are busy enough. Yeah. All right, Commissioners, that will take us to our items at hand for Committee of the Whole, and we'll start with the first one. This is a resolution setting a public hearing to consider Housing Advisory Committee recommendations, item numbers 1, 4, 5, and 7.
So moved.
Support. Great, thank you. So Kira Wood and Jessica also, I'll let you two tag team on these 4. I know colleagues were all well aware of these. 2 of them, though, we talked about in Economic Development Project Team, and we made the recommendation, Commissioner O'Connor, Commissioner Kelly, and I, to move them forward today to be reviewed at COW and to set a public hearing. So I'll turn it over to Kira.
Yes, so you've reviewed numbers 1 and 7 at length here at Committee of the Whole with Jessica. Items number 4 and 5 were reviewed at Economic Development Project Team, as the mayor indicated. I can go through some of the highlights of that discussion if you're interested. The Neighborhood Enterprise Zone modifications to the City Commission policy suggest establishing baseline qualification criteria, reducing the standard term of the exemption, and modifying the city's investment criteria. And really that also includes some cleanup language for diversity and inclusion edits that were necessary. And do you want me to go into the detail on the policy changes?
I think we've all had ample opportunity to review these.
Okay, good.
And I feel like we've talked through all 11. And so I guess I'll turn to my colleagues to see if they have specific questions. So what's before us today is to set a public hearing for January 9th. And that will give us time to to review them, but also to hear from the public and get input even between now and January 9th. But colleagues, do you have any questions for Kira? Commissioner?
Not really a question for Kara. I just think for me, I don't know exactly how I feel about all these, as we all don't, we're sitting a hearing, which I think is an important part of the process and what's going on. So I just wanted to state that I haven't weighed in or even looked at in depth at all what's here. So I just wanted to make that point clear, and I guess we'll work through that. You all will work through that next year.
And you can still weigh in.
I'm going to give the comment at the hearing. Right.
So Kira, why don't you tell us about the VEDA one?
So the Voluntary Equitable Development Agreement policy recommendation is a new policy that does not currently exist. Essentially what it does is provides for the ability for developers to enter into a three-party agreement with the city and a neighborhood community-based organization that would allow the investor to voluntarily commit to various goals and joint interests in order to create a pathway for investment to proceed. We've had an experience with one of those already, and as suggested by the Housing Advisory Committee, these agreements would allow for community involvement through that process as well. So essentially, alerting neighbors to development or investment that might be occurring in their neighborhood and working together on a pathway forward. Now keep in mind that these are voluntary. That was discussed at length at the Economic Development Project team. And also note that it would only generally apply to private development on city-owned property and projects seeking investments from the city's Affordable Housing Fund, and any private investment project in excess of $10 million. So that threshold was set at a high bar because we know that this would take additional time and resources, and projects of a significant size would then have a significant impact on a community as well. So those are the ones that we wanted to consider as eligible for this voluntary agreement opportunity.
So Kira, economic development, we talked about this, and I used the word community benefit agreement, and which I think is a more common, I think people are more familiar with what that means. Can you just talk a little bit about why we're going with this voluntary, I'll just call VEDA because it's kind of a mouthful, versus the language around a community benefit agreement? I know they're similar, so maybe you can just elaborate on that a little bit.
Sure. So this is really a voluntary opportunity for the investor and the neighborhood group to work with the city on moving a path forward for any given project over $10 million. It helps the neighborhood have a clear understanding of developments that are occurring in their neighborhood of substantial size, and also gives them a voice at the table when those agreements are being negotiated. So we believe that the projects on city-owned property, investment from the Affordable Housing Fund, and then also those that are of a significant size, have an impact on the surrounding community, and we certainly want to make sure that we have the necessary time and resource to go through the process with the neighborhood community groups. So, and providing them also an opportunity to evaluate the outcomes of that agreement once it's solidified. And so as economic development already monitors and maintains the agreements on tax abatements, it would be a similar type arrangement where we would monitor and report to economic development project team on the outcomes delivered by these agreements as well.
So Commissioners, this really came from the experience we just had with the MOU between Noble, Grand Valley, and the city, as we really worked to ensure that there was that the neighbors' voice were heard, concerns were addressed, but also that there was a direct impact on some of the goals that neighborhood had laid out. And so that really kind of set the foundation for this idea around this voluntary agreement. And we're using that language because it is different than what some other cities have done related to a community benefit agreement. So this is a little more nuanced, but it's also based on our learnings from the process that we just went through in Noble. Is that accurate?
Exactly.
Okay. All right. Questions, Commissioner?
No, I just want to add that that agreement was, I think, very important because not only did it address that current situation, but since then we have, I think, a better relationship, and we're having more conversations about how we work together as city, neighborhood, and an institution, and it's even spread, I think, beyond those institutions into conversations with the other players on Medical Mile and issues like around parking and street design and so on. So I think that the benefit of this is that it continues. It started that important conversation and brought us all together for similar purposes.
Yeah. Commissioner Lanier?
Yeah, so Kira, thanks so much for presenting. Do you know about how many projects we would have that would fit into this category? It seems a little narrow with the dollar amount and the city having to have ownership at some point of the land.
Yeah, it's
So-
probably around 5 a year at the most.
Okay.
And some years will be less than that, depending
Okay.
on how much city-owned property is available for redevelopment and how many large projects we see in a given year. This year, our numbers are down in terms of those larger projects, but a lot of them are under construction currently. So that's not to say we won't have that many next year. We very well could.
And so why do we have the city-owned property as one of the requirements? Is there room to?
It's not a requirement, remember, it's still voluntary.
Well, no. I mean, as a requirement to apply for this. I heard that was one of, so it's.
It's an opportunity. So it's an opportunity for you as city commissioners to enter into a voluntary agreement with whoever is going to develop your property so that you and the neighborhood can work together on achieving some community-wide goals.
So what I'm asking is, why is it necessary why couldn't this agreement be made between a developer and the neighborhood and even the city, maybe being involved at some level without there having to be property owned by the city to be a part of the discussion?
It could very well happen that way.
Okay.
The trouble is we didn't anticipate doing this on every project, and so the threshold was established to be $10 million and over because of the substantial size and the ability to contribute to the neighborhood.
Okay.
And then two, the city-owned properties, certainly with those we hope to achieve citywide goals. So we had to set the bar somewhere because, if we did one of these agreements on every project, we would have a significant amount of contract administration work.
Well,
So it's just eligibility, it's not required. So it's saying,
Yeah,
okay,
exactly.
for these types of projects, this will be a potential tool that could be used. It doesn't have to be used.
Right.
But it's just we talked about this at Economic Development Project Team because we had similar questions, that this is really just creating a tool that doesn't exist today with some guidelines based on learnings that we had from the recent experience with Noble.
If I could,
Commissioner?
Mayor, yeah, I tend to agree with my colleague, Commissioner Lanier. With regards to this being perhaps made available or language that would be included that would speak to projects other than those that would be built on city-owned property, the question I have is if you could throw a number out to me, a ballpark figure of how many projects every year do we have in the neighborhoods that's in excess of $10 million?
It's probably less than 5 on any given year.
All right. So, I mean,
Yeah, so that you're thinking like I'm thinking, so if we were to include those projects,
Yeah.
then it obviously would increase the number of potential projects, but it would also help developers in the community to come alongside one another to create whatever it is that they're trying to create, especially at the magnitude of $10 million. I mean, that's a pretty significant project.
big number.
so.
Yeah.
So you're thinking reduce the threshold for eligibility.
Absolutely. To eliminate having to be on city-owned property.
I don't know if I understand exactly what you're
So maybe
suggesting.
pull up the language around eligibility, because it's not and, it's
or.
or.
Okay.
It doesn't have to be.
Okay.
So
there are
maybe
three-
explain, it's not that it has to be.
It is my last.
It's, is that your point you were going to make, Commissioner Schaefer?
No.
So it's not a requirement. It could be like the property in Noble. We didn't own any of that land.
Right, so okay, because that's exactly
So
what I'm
it's
thinking.
or, right?
Okay.
So it could be a public entity, it could be, I don't have the language right
So
up in
it's-
front of me,
I'm
but it'd be
looking at
nice
it,
to
but
maybe
I don't-
pull that up.
So it's private development in excess of $10 million, development on city-owned property, or any public or private project seeking investment from the city's Affordable Housing Fund.
So what I'm reading doesn't have or. it has those 3 items, but it doesn't have the word "or." So that tells me that
we
those
should
3
edit that.
things are required in order to apply for this.
So that is probably where the confusion, we should.
We'll clarify that
If
one.
it's "or," then I'm good, but
Right.
without the "or," then
can
it's
clarify
requiring
it.
city-owned property.
Yeah.
We can clarify it prior to the public hearing.
Yeah.
Please, thank you.
Yeah, and Kara, just for information, it may be helpful to have a summary of some of the projects over the last couple of years that were over 10 million, and then, maybe have that compared to projects over 5 million, just so we could get a sense, because that's what we talked about in economic development project team is 10 million too high of a threshold? Could it be reduced to 5? So maybe if we just had a little information about that, then we could make a more informed decision about whether we want to reduce that
Yep,
threshold.
we can include that in the public hearing.
Yeah, okay. Does that sound good, Commissioner? And then we can review that? Okay, Commissioner?
It just, at one point with some of the, not just this change, but others that are in there, is that I think that what's kind of being talked about here is, and I know that Commissioner Kelly has talked about before about a nudge, and that's been a wording, I think that's there. So I think that's how I would probably characterize this. I just think that the experience with Grand Valley and Noble was a very unique experience in my mind. There were some unique factors at play there that caused that, and so I think we also should think about, as we're looking to do this, that we may need to look at, in my mind, provide some additional incentive as these things come through, and maybe we can look at the legalities of doing that, because whether it's longer process or whether it's other things that you've kind of put into your project, there is a pro forma that you need to meet that market rate project. So I think that's a thought as we look to this too. I know my whole thought with this is how do we assign value so that we have a really good understanding of what it is that we're asking for, what it is that we're getting, and what it is that it's being given. So it's just a thought as we go through. Again, it's a hearing, like we said before, so we're setting that hearing, but that's just some thoughts I'm thinking as I'm looking through these suggestions.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. All right, anything else on this one?
If I could just
Okay,
make mention
Commissioner?
of the fact that it's my belief that moving forward, that we would probably expect to see the vast majority of development in our city occurring in neighborhoods. And the example that was set by the agreement, the MOU between Grand Valley, the city, and the neighbors of Belknap Lookout, I think served as a wonderful example of the complexity and the difficulty of getting something like that done, because ultimately you have the rights of Grand Valley State University, and you have also the rights of the neighbors to be able to speak as to what they want in their community. And I think it was from my understanding and my, being there and seeing it play out, I think it was a very healthy, it was hard, but it was a very healthy process. And I think there's a lot to learn from it, especially, again, as we move forward. I don't expect development to slow down in neighborhoods. And so what is it that we can do to make sure that neighbors feel as if they're going to have the best possible opportunity to engage in this process of saying what they want in their community. And so, again, and through this, to what my colleague Commissioner Kelly said, it's actually improved relationships with institutions that probably weren't as strong, before Belknap project. And so I think there's real benefit here, and I can appreciate the voluntary side of things. But I just think we need to be very, very intentional about stating that we want to make sure that voices have an opportunity to speak to community voices have an opportunity to speak to what they want in their neighborhood.
That's an excellent point. Yeah, thank you, Commissioner. All right. And then the other two we heard about when we talked about last week, go ahead.
I'm sorry, before we get off this one, there are some fees attached to this, but it didn't list the amount of those fees. I do see that the developer will be the one to pay those fees. Do we have, though, any idea of the range?
We don't
that
yet.
we're
We
looking-
would include that with the the fee omnibus that comes to you each year. So generally, we don't list the actual amount of the fees in the policy because those would change each year. But we can maybe provide some idea of what those could be.
I think that'll be helpful as we're prior to the public hearing or at the public hearing so that people will have an idea of what that would cost. Going back to your point, Commissioner Jones, that, you know, if we're strongly suggesting it, you know, to know about how much it'll cost developers will be important for that discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, very good. And the other two commissioners we talked about last week, and Jessica made some changes based on our feedback, some language changes. So any additional questions or feedback about those two items? All right, then I'm going to go ahead and call the question. And again, this is to set the public hearing for January 9th. Oh, City Manager wants to weigh in before I do that?
I just would like to be clear, with this action, you are setting one public hearing for all 4 recommendations.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. Right. This will be one public hearing for all 4 items, which is why they're all included on this resolution. The other thing, though, City Manager, on January 9th, we're also going to get an update from the Grand Rapids Housing Commission.
Yes, at your briefing.
At our briefing. So, Commissioners, we are working on that as well, and so you can anticipate that on January 9th. In addition to these being on our agenda in the evening meeting for a public hearing, we'll have some additional housing items on our agenda in the morning.
Great.
So,
Mayor?
yeah.
Given that we are doing more than one at a time, I think it's important that we push that information out to those who have been interested, and we have this new webpage now.
I was just going to mention that.
So I don't know how we can, perhaps through the contacts that we had on our own housing advisory committee that John chaired and others through the neighborhoods, just get this out so that people have the time, you know.
Yeah.
There's a good deal of time in between, but
agree.
nevertheless, it's several
I agree.
complicated policies.
City Manager, can you write this on your to-do list to include an email with an update about the public hearings, as well as a link to the webpage that was just created? And Commissioners, if you haven't seen that, it's on the city's web homepage, I should say. But 311, Becky Jo, her web team worked with community development to get a really nice web page out there that includes a summary of all of the recommendations. In addition, it has information about the eviction court and other work that we're doing. So please help spread the word about that. And then, City Manager, if you can send an email with an update about the public hearings and a link to that website to everyone who served on the Housing Advisory, but also to our list of folks who served on the Housing Strategy work list or work group, which
I'll try to find
Connie
that.
should have.
Okay.
It's about 200 people, is what I remember from attending those meetings. But I think it's really important that anyone who's been engaged in this discussion with us over the last 2 years, that they're informed proactively that we're working on this.
Yeah, just one thing to add, and I know that email's already getting long, but just to state that, well, it is important to come and speak if you want to, is that if they want to send commentary in earlier in writing, given the complexity of some of the issues and the amount of issues, I think that everyone will, well, I'm going to be here, but will read it and take that feedback just as valuable as if you came up to speak verbally to it as well. Because I think some of these issues, a lot of individuals will probably feel are more complex than they can get after in that 3 minutes. That might help that flow of that evening.
Yeah, that's a good point. We should also ask Stacy Stout to send it out to her network with the neighborhood association so that the neighborhoods are all well aware of this too.
Yeah, what's the link? The website link?
Yeah, it's
That's okay.
I'll email it to you. Yes, because I just posted it, but it's on. I believe it's on our.
It was in my weekly to you.
Oh, it's not on the homepage? Oh, I thought it was by now. So we should get that on our homepage. But yes, we'll get that out today, this morning. All right, so now I'll call the question. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed? It carries. All right, next, Carrie, you can just stay up here. We have a resolution establishing an obsolete property rehabilitation district for JV Enterprise at 2007 South Division Avenue. Can I get it?
So moved, or support?
All right, Commissioners, so we had a public hearing about this last week. I think we've heard about it a few times now. Kara, you want to add anything?
So on the application for the district and the certificate, this is a 10-year obsolete property rehabilitation exemption certificate request. The owner of the property plans to rehabilitate the obsolete structure, and it includes a significant investment on South Division, $438,000 to facilitate opportunities for new or expanding retailers in that area of Burton Heights. This owner is actively engaged in organizing efforts in that area and has discussed the project with all of the groups involved in planning initiatives in the Burton Heights and South Division, Granville areas. The Economic Development Project team also considered this at their November 14th meeting.
Great. All right, Commissioners, any questions? All right, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, it carries. All right, next will take us to a resolution approving a 10-year obsolete property rehabilitation exemption certificate for the same property that we just talked about on South Division. Can I?
Support.
All right. Any additional questions, Commissioners? These are companion items. All right, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, it carries. All right, next up will take us to a resolution establishing an obsolete property rehabilitation district for Hermitage Partners at 1009 or 1001-1009 Hermitage Street Southeast.
So moved. Support.
All right, Carrie, you want to tell us about this?
Again, we held a public hearing on the facilitation of restoration and stabilization of this property. This is just a district establishment request because this would allow the owner to continue with the stabilization work without risking the ability to qualify for a future exemption certificate at a later date should they find, a new owner. So it's really just placing in place the tools for a future acquisition.
Great. All right, Commissioners, anything to add?
Well, just that we so appreciate the work that's happening on this building. It was so close to caving in and probably would have this winter had that roof net been put on. So at great expense to the neighborhood, the residents, Carol Moore, of course, leading the charge on this. They have secured the roof. It's safe, and hopefully this will be turned into a wonderful asset, not only for the community, but also for Grand Rapids Public Schools.
Yeah, it's a really incredible vision for this space that I think could add a lot to the community. So, yeah. All right, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, it carries. All right, Commissioners, next we have a discussion item regarding our, this is in follow-up to our conversation we had, my goodness, was it a couple weeks ago, about the SDM and SDD alcohol sales. So I will call Suzanne up. Hopefully all of you received information from Suzanne and some background. I know she's been working on this since our discussion. She took to heart some of the comments that we had and concerns, and I think tried to provide a pretty balanced approach that not only takes into consideration the concerns of the neighbors, but also those who are seeking to obtain one of these licenses. So I'm just going to turn it over to Suzanne. Commissioners, my hope is that we can talk through this and talk through the recommendations before us and give some direction to the planning department.
Good morning, Mayor and Commissioners. I provided you with a hard copy. That's what's being passed around, just in case you didn't have that. So I also included the alcohol review standards because the Planning Commission in 2008, we had gone through alcohol discussions. This is a recurring issue. And the alcohol review standards are in addition to the special land use standards that you had, and we really didn't discuss those last time. And the reason I'm providing those is that under the evaluation considerations and even the minimal secondary effects on the neighborhood, those do provide somewhat of a framework for consideration as we talk about the table that I've given you. So when they were looking at minimal secondary effects and how they define those, to develop this language, we actually looked throughout the country at other ordinances and other regulatory approaches. So negative secondary effects can include the following impacts: vehicular and pedestrian traffic, particularly during late night or early morning hours that might disturb area residents; noise, odors, lights that emanate beyond the site boundaries onto property in the area, which are residential dwellings; excessive numbers of persons gathering outside the establishment; peak hours of use that add to congestion or other negative effects in the neighborhood; fighting, brawling, outside urination, or other behavior that can accompany intoxication, robbery, shoplifting, and other crimes that affect party stores, convenience stores, and other retail establishments open late. And under the evaluation considerations, they did kind of define a line. For example, for restaurants that close before midnight, that those were considered to have a minimal negative secondary impact. And so over time, we've actually taken those out where it's no longer a special land use with the Planning Commission. Those are now administrative approvals because we said if it's a minimal secondary effect or no impact, then it should just be administrative approval. They also looked at involving retail sales of beer, wine, and other alcoholic beverages for off-premises consumption. So that's your SDM and SDD licenses. If they closed before 11, they were presumed to have a minimal negative secondary impact. And that, but there's also a caveat in there that still we need to look at, the proposed location and potential instances of negative secondary impacts that we need to be mindful of as listed in Part 5. So I just bring that to your attention as we begin this discussion. So what I did is I went back after the memo that had been provided to you on November 28th and looked at a matrix. This is an expansion of the matrix that was provided in that memo. And so on page 2 of this memo, you'll see regulatory approaches being in the left-hand column. And then under review process, there's 3 different approaches that could be used. One is administrative approval. The second is special land use. And the third is Board of Zoning Appeals, where technically it would be a prohibited use, and the only way to get approval for that would be to seek a use variance, which may or may not be successful. The options, this is really just kind of a menu of options of different approaches that we could use. And I think part of it is that right now, the alcohol approvals that we have, there aren't clear defined boundaries of defining what is minimal impact and what isn't. And so this does help define a little bit more what that might mean from a neighborhood perspective. And then if the City Commission so chose, if you were comfortable with some of those, we could change to administrative approval for some requests. Or if you feel that alcohol is enough of a neighborhood concern that it should be all special land uses, we could also provide additional regulatory kind of guidance to the Planning Commission on what that means, kind of where are those thresholds that you envision. Right now, as I mentioned before, we have other guidance for other land uses in the Special Land Use Article 9 of the zoning ordinance that says, for example, an auto body shop, if it's on less than an acre, we tend to have parking issues in the neighborhood and the lots are overcrowded. So that kind of 1 acre standard for a auto body place does help provide guidance on understanding where we think we're kind of on the edge of having impacts that might surround a neighborhood. So in this case, the first row is hours of operation, whether or not the use closes before midnight. And then if it's after midnight or more than 20 hours in a 24-hour period, it would require special land use approval. This is similar to what we already do for restaurants, but we could also do that for party stores. Or you could also say that if it's, nothing good happens after midnight, and we don't want to see sales happening after midnight, and you could take that approach and just say, after midnight, it's not okay. Proximity to other SDD license.
Can we hold right there?
Sure.
Just so I'll start with Commissioner Lanier.
So Suzanne, the memo from the 11th, I went back to the packet of information from November 28th, and I can see that this chart has been expanded from the one in November 28th. What I don't feel like I'm quite understanding is what's the current practice? So all of this feels like new options, but I don't know what, for all of the regulation approaches, I don't know what the current practice is. So
the current practice is none of these currently are in the ordinance.
Okay.
So you're starting from basically zero. What we have is the standards that the Planning Commission looks at, but anybody can come in and ask for anything. Okay. So if if I want to sell beer and wine in my party store, I can come in and I can say I want to stay open till 2 a.m. I want 2/3 of the store to all be beer and wine.
But so they're all special land use because the planning commission is making the decision. But at this point, there are no specific things for the planning commission to consider as they're making the decision. They're only looking at these standards, so it's more subjective in how they have the outcomes of the decisions that they're making.
Correct.
Got it.
Understand very well.
Okay,
Yep,
thank you.
and thank you for clarifying that, because last time we talked, this is all we had, and there was a lot of feedback, and including from neighborhoods, saying this is really subjective, and we want more clear-cut, objective guidelines for these requests that we're now getting fast and furious because of the MLCC rule changes.
Yes, and just as a reminder, I know I included it in my correspondence to you, but we will have 8 gas station requests coming up in the next 2 months and 5 dollar store requests. Just so you know.
So this conversation is urgent.
And that's before the SDD rule really kicks in with the half-mile rule. If that's lifted and there's no legislation that's approved.
Suzanne, one I shouldn't say discrepancy. One thing I noticed was that in these guidelines, the closing time was 11 p.m., where in what you're presenting is midnight. Is there a reason for that?
It can be 11 p.m. I think when we were working at this, and then I was later reviewing this after I had already sent this out, I didn't reconcile the two.
Okay, I just wondered if there was a reason for that.
Well,
Because this is typically what we hear from neighbors. Okay.
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, and first of all, I appreciate the work on this. This is great. Can't see with that. Celebrate.
It's Christmas time.
Do a cha-cha while we talk about alcohol.
Commissioner?
I know as it relates to not just this topic, but a lot of topics, you guys have looked at decisions that have been made by the Planning Commission over the course of time to establish a pattern of approval. Mm-hmm. And so I think looking at is it 12 o'clock is the standard for a restaurant now?
For a restaurant, yes.
Right. So if a restaurant wants to open with an alcohol use, the pattern has been we always gave that option. So then it became an administrative decision rather than have to go through the process, because if we never said no, then that seems to be an acceptable community standard. So I think you're just trying to pattern some of this off of past precedent.
That's correct.
Okay.
But it's specifically for off-premise sales. So this is for
So you're
SDN,
patterning
SDD.
the off-premise after the on-premise.
Exactly.
Yes.
Okay, so that's helpful. Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Kelly?
Well,
Do you have a question?
Yeah, I tried to figure this out, and I know I emailed you yesterday because I wasn't sure either what was current and what was proposed. So just a question, I want to go through these one at a time. I think this is very helpful, Suzanne. So currently, for SDM licenses, they close at 11, currently.
No, they do, there's no requirement for closing hours. It's whatever the Planning Commission approves.
Oh, okay, all right, so.
So it
but
could
it has
vary
gone.
based on the request.
And do we have a sense what the average is in town or not?
It really depends. Sometimes it's really whatever the store owner wants. Generally, midnight. The Planning Commission just approved the Beer City request, which is for a liquor store with beer and wine, and they requested I think it was their hours Monday through Thursday, I think were until 11 p.m., and then Friday and Saturday till 2 a.m., and the Planning Commission just recently approved that at their last meeting. So it really depends on
The neighborhood?
The neighborhood and
Proximity to residents and that sort of thing, or?
I think
Or maybe it's all over.
it does depend on neighborhood feedback, but the applicant's really requesting, and sometimes they'll usually, I think the biggest instance where I see them scaling back hours that are being requested by someone who wants to do alcohol is for outdoor service because of outdoor noise potential, and so they have started to develop a standard for that. We have a table that they use so that they know in the neighborhood district what all the approvals have been, so they can start to standardize that. And that's becoming more uniform, and eventually I can see us doing a standard by neighborhood on what those hours of operation are.
Like Harmony and Easttown,
Yeah.
because of proximity to residents.
Yep.
They're outside.
But we currently don't. It really is whatever the applicant's requesting and whatever the Planning Commission feels is appropriate for the neighborhood.
Commissioner?
Well, I also think it's important to, in establishing a standard of midnight, just using it as the example, is okay. And it's not to say that a business is going to stay open every night till midnight, but I feel like it's important that we don't dive too deeply into this. Because sometimes you realize, we all go in with the best laid plans, but what happens in practicality sometimes changes, right? So maybe you realize that Thursday nights are much busier than you anticipated, and if we arbitrarily say, well, you can only be open until 10 o'clock on Thursday night, we're hamstringing in someone's ability to, well, maybe there's a reason somebody wants to buy wine after 10 o'clock on Thursday night that we didn't anticipate. But it's not to say that they're going to stay open till, I think there's lots of businesses that have been approved to stay open later than they do, but don't do it. You also reserve that right for New Year's Eve, right? The state allows you to sell later into the night on a New Year's Eve for one special night of the year. Not everyone chooses to stay up until 4 o'clock, but the state gives you that option. If the city has approved you to stay up until 2, you can then stay up until 4. Lots of places still close at 12:30 on New Year's Eve, even if they have the ability to do. So just don't want to overly restrict it, and then if someone opens their doors and then realizes, well, I thought that was a good idea when I didn't have an operating business, but now that I'm operating, I have to go back and try to change it. So.
Yeah, no, good point. Commissioner?
I think that's a really good point. The only thing that I'm thinking about that may change that, a variable about the residents. So there are businesses that are located on, a busy street, and then there are businesses that are located kind of in the heart, in the middle of a neighborhood. I'm thinking about the one on Giddings near the library on off Hall Street. And so that one being open at midnight would cause a lot of traffic and noise to a neighborhood that, and all around it, is homes, which is different than Kalamazoo and Boston Square area where it's a busy street. So I think I like your point that we probably should just define what it is, but is there a way to also include in that?
I think I'm kind of looking at the other list about proximity to things. And I think you also have to look at past land use pattern. That I think there's places within our communities and all of our neighborhoods where there's things that exist, kind of old school corner stores that probably wouldn't be approved as a use anymore because they're grandfathered in. They don't meet the current land use standards. So that they're not going to we're not going to be able to put one on the corner of Hamilton and Crosby again because it just doesn't exist in the zoning code, that possibility.
So will that come up with the piece about proximity to
residential?
Yep, it's on the table. It's third from the bottom.
Okay.
The two things. One, if there's special circumstances for businesses, we do have temporary permits. So if we have a banquet hall that says, it's a special holiday, and even though we're only open until midnight, but this is a unique circumstance, we do grant special permission as administrative, understanding, they get only so many requests a year, but we do allow for special circumstances. And you could, again, there's the way that it's laid out in the tables, for example, hours of operation, you could say if it closes before, if you're going to say 11 p.m. as a party store, staff can approve it. But if it's after 11 p.m., the neighbors get to be heard, and it has to go to Planning Commission special land use. So we can make those distinctions here, or you could even say 10 p.m. Whatever you think is the best, or you could also say no, everything needs to be heard. So it's really kind of these are the options. So. Mayor, I don't know if you want to go through each one and just kind of see where the temperature of the commission is for each row, or...
Let's see if we can get to the mind of the commission on these items, because I know this is timely and we don't meet again until January, and I know that there are requests in the making. So commissioners, why don't we give Suzanne an opportunity to just walk through each of them.
Okay.
And we'll see if we can come to some consensus around this table to give some direction to the planning department. Does that sound acceptable? Okay.
Did you want her to go through all of them first and then we'll weigh in, or do you want to weigh in as we go?
Okay, let's do one at a time.
Okay, and it could be. So it's tricky because it'd be useful for each one, but I think also it could be a combination of things, because this is like everything in the kitchen sink. So it doesn't, you can say, no, we don't like that one at all. But the combination of maybe it's these hours with this proximity, that has a different layer to it. But we'll go through them. So hours of operation, as the mayor pointed out in the review standards right now, it says 11 p.m. It could be 11, if it closes before 11 p.m., it's administrative review, and after that, it's planning commission. Or you could also have the option of saying you can't sell anything after midnight.
What-
or another
Mayor.
hour if there's a different hour.
Mayor, what about grocery stores? I mean, is that in here too? I guess I'm trying to figure out how that would, because I mean, that's one I would think you would, I'd have a logical expectation that I could go in 24 hours to a 24-hour.
So that is,
Open
so
grocery
maybe I'll talk through all of them. Let's do that.
Let's do that.
Let's do
That
that,
one-
because it's in there, yes.
I was going to say, I think there so many of these are tied together.
Yes. Yeah.
Why don't we go through all of them? Give Suzanne a chance to present them and provide the logic behind it. And then we can weigh in. And if there are specific ones that we feel strongly about, then we can talk about those items.
Perfect.
Does that sound good? Okay.
So the second one is proximity to other SDD licensed establishments. So this is kind of a pulling in of that half-mile rule that the MLCC has had in place and will be pulling back. So if administrative approval, if it's more than a half-mile of an existing SDD license, that's assuming that you'd even be comfortable with staff approving a liquor store. The Planning Commission, within a half-mile of an existing SDD license, so if it's less than that area, then that would allow for the Planning Commission to review it, or you could uphold the MLCC standard that's been in place, that there's no SDD licenses within a half-mile of one another, and that's the current practice, or has been, but with that rule lifting by the MLCC, that will open up additional requests for persons who want to have a license within a half-mile of another establishment.
So in other words, we could locally
Yes.
continue that.
You could continue that.
You also have to remember that that is for the implementation of a new license, correct?
If it's already
Because you can
existing,
transfer a
yes.
license
Right.
and be within
Right.
less than a half mile. So this is for the issuance of new licenses.
New licenses, right.
Yeah.
So how did that happen with the Shell station?
This Shell station is just selling beer and wine. It's an SDM.
There's
So it's
two
beer and
categories
wine,
of
not
license.
liquor.
Yeah.
Gosh, this is.
I know.
Yes.
I know. This is so much fun.
Oh, that failed.
This is why we do ad hoc committees. So concentration of off-premise licenses. So whether or not you want to regulate a concentration of them, if there are too many that are all together. So if there's no SDD or SDM license within a quarter-mile radius, that could also be a half-mile radius. But if there's not one nearby within a neighborhood, then it might be okay. If there is up to two, that maybe the Planning Commission needs to hear it just to get some additional input from the community, or you don't want to have three or more, or you want to regulate a certain number where you say once everybody has, certain number of establishments are in a community, then there should be no more. So that's a kind of that one I think is a little bit tricky from a neighborhood business standpoint, because you're getting so many requests but with SDD and SDM, I don't know if you are worried about concentration, but this would address that. The grocery store item for Commissioner Shaper, gross floor area, if it's more than 5,000 square feet, so if it's more like it starts to get of a scale, although 5,000 isn't huge, but we could also up that number to 10,000. So most grocery stores, for example, the Meijer on Bridge is 40,000. The one that's being proposed for Diamond Place is 25,000.
Yeah.
So that kind of gives you an idea. So we can also make those distinctions between administrative approval. We currently already do this for larger grocery stores, but it has to be 50,000 square feet. So that number could be lowered to, given our experience now with urban retailers doing grocery. Shelf cooler space. This is in response to the Planning Commission, as they have established that pattern of behavior or approvals. They have been looking at kind of what is the overall sales area that's being dedicated for beer and wine. And typically they're finding it's 2% or less of the gross floor area, 16 square feet or less of shelf space, and no more than 2 cooler doors. That's kind of about the standard that they've been approving, and we've been giving them a table for every approval that they have, and they're being able to compare their previously approved ones with the ones that they're hearing now. And so that seems to be kind of a standard that they're setting and feeling like there's minimal impact. And that one I think I would recommend as an administrative approval because it's becoming standardized. Planning Commission, if they wanted more than that, if the request was greater than 2% or 16 square feet of shelf space, or more than 2 cooler doors, would go to the Planning Commission.
Now, question, could it also go either that or to Board of Zoning Appeals?
I'm sorry, you mean or go to the Board
Their
of Zoning?
choice between, I mean, you've got BZA here too.
Yeah, so the BZA would be if they wanted to sell even more. I mean, if you wanted a full-on beer and wine store, liquor store, that then you could say, well, we don't want any of those, and you have to go to the Board of Zoning Appeals. I mean, that would be an option. So you're kind of setting a bumper between 2% and 49% could go to the Planning Commission, but you're not interested in having stores that only sell beer and wine or only liquor.
Okay.
So that's an option. Percent sales, this is a little bit more difficult, and this is more difficult from an enforcement standpoint and to track, because then we actually have to ask for sales information. But administrative approval, less than 33% of the store gross sales is from the sales of alcohol. Planning Commission, more than 33%. And BZA, again, kind of that, if you're all selling beer and wine and liquor, then it wouldn't be allowed unless you could get a variance from the Board of Zoning Appeals. Ratio of food to alcohol. The sales area for fresh food is greater than alcohol sales area. So that's something to consider, although again, from an enforcement standpoint, this is difficult because we'd have to go in and see how much they're selling. We did have a recent conversation, the last approval that the Planning Commission gave for a gas station, that we did ask the question about, are you displacing healthy food from a cooler and replacing it with beer and wine? So are you taking out the milk and cheese and other offerings that if you're a neighbor, you're serving the neighborhood, are you taking those things out? And the response in this case was no, that butter and eggs and things like that are a staple of that business. But we could ask that question and look at that. The next one is proximity to residentially zoned property. So more than 300 feet from a residentially zoned parcel, which would be the LDR or MDR zone districts. 300 feet is about a city block. And we have used the 300-foot standard for other items, including electronic message centers, a couple other things, outdoor seating areas, where we say, is it close enough, and how does it impact somebody? So if it's the residential proximity, if it's more than 300 feet, we'd recommend Planning Commission. And you could say none of them are allowed if they're within 300 feet of a residentially zoned area. So you have some versions there. You could say none, it's an administrative approval if it's outside of that, or anything is Planning Commission approval. So you could do that. Proximity to parks or schools, same kind of 300-foot separation distance. And then crime prevention through environmental design, we use this as a standard, and we would just codify this. We have found a lot of success in working with the Vice Unit to have a subtet analysis done for both the inside and outside of the store. And we do not have that currently in code. We do have elements of it in the code. For example, we require that the cash register has a viewable window so we can see the cash register, and that they're not covering it with signage. Again, it's an enforcement issue because party stores like to do lots of signage. And we have become more clear in the Planning Commission approvals about the types of signage and really putting those right in the approvals so that it's not in code, so that when the business owner gets their letter saying you've been approved, here's all the conditions of your approval, it's clear to them what that is. And we're continuing to refine that process. One idea we've had is electronic message centers, for example. When they sign off on the permit, we have them initial all the requirements, so assuming that they've read them all. So that's it.
And then what about your Good Neighbor plan?
Yes, and then the Good Neighbor Plan, I did bring copies. I don't know if you wanted those, but we have an example from Sarasota, Florida, that actually one of our staff people used to work there, and she said that they have found it to be quite effective, where the Good Neighbor Plan applies to convenience stores of any retail establishments under 4,000 square feet of gross floor area. and/or open at least 15 hours a day. And they have used it in Sarasota through their special land use process, but I think we could also require that as an administrative approval. We do that right now with an operations plan, that they have to give us some sort of operations plan, but it's not done with correspondence with the neighborhood. And so the Good Neighbor Plan, are you looking for it? Did you want that?
I would, yes, I am looking, you read my mind.
Right at the very end of
At the end of the agenda item.
Right here. Okay. Well, she's passing around.
So I included Courtney's email in that too. But really, it's plans and procedures, additional site plan. What the Good Neighbor Plan has is a crime prevention and awareness training, alcohol and awareness training, litter control, loitering control, trespass enforcement, landscape maintenance, and neighborhood communication. And it's a record of good faith that they submit as part of their Good Neighbor Plan, that is part of the approval, that is tied to what they've agreed to do with the neighborhood. And so the neighborhood is able to state their expectations with the business owner, and that formalized process happens before the formal land use approval is given. And that can be done as part of the Planning Commission. It can be done as part of administrative approval, whichever you would like. And what we would probably do is then we would take this language and enter it. We would formalize it as part of the code language in the zoning ordinance.
Okay.
So do you have a sense, Suzanne, if you did the Good Neighbor Plan, what makes more sense in terms of, we don't want to delay the process too much, but I like the idea of having this.
But we're okay with delaying the process.
So Commissioner Kelly, finish what you're,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Yeah, just, a question of your sense of the time that it takes to go through this, administrative approval versus land use approval.
The administrative approval is a lot easier because they'll submit for a license and we go through that process with them and if it meets the criteria, we can sign off on the license when it comes from the clerk's office and they're good. We do have those additional requirements. For example, that operations plan we already require. Yeah. And for the businesses, what we found is that because we've gotten enough examples now, that it serves as a template and they have to go through. It's similar to if you own a restaurant and you have to do standard operating procedures for the health department. We view it the same way, that it's just like your SOPs for your sale of beer and wine or liquor, that this is part of doing business and it helps them think through what they're doing. So I think the Good Neighbor Plan could fit into that. Okay. I think, and it's just getting their homework done beforehand and when they come in. And I think it does, especially like litter is a big issue around these, and some of the noise and activity. So one part that was in this Good Neighbor Plan, which I thought was great, is making sure that the employees can monitor the parking lot and can keep an eye on things. So it's just kind of that accountability piece, I think, that we really like. But the administrative approval is relatively simple. The Planning Commission approval process takes from the date of application till hearing. They only usually have one hearing. It's rare to have a hearing item tabled for this, and so generally it's 5 weeks, although the Planning Commission right now, because of all the requests, has a backlog. We're now taking applications for February 22nd. So we're stacking up.
Yeah. Commissioners, other questions, comments? Commissioner?
Well, I certainly, again, appreciate you and your staff putting some thought around this, and codifying some of these things, I think, is ways to do some administrative approval and then some things to have to require a special land use with some different conditions, I think is a great process. For me, it's just figuring out which of these are which ones we should implement and can implement. I think there's a couple on here. The hours of operation. Like, I think the idea that if somebody wants to do it and be open until midnight, and that can be administratively approved, that's great. If you want to sell after midnight, then I'm okay with that being a special land use. I think that helps expedite that process. A couple of the things I just get a little concerned about, let's see here. The floor area one, I'm not actually that concerned about the floor area because I think of some of our we all talk about wanting more neighborhood retail, and I think of some. And I think that it also applies to the ratio of food. I don't really like that one either, only because I think of some some places I think many of us have probably been, like Art of the Table or Siciliano's Market, where they're not necessarily grocery stores, but they sell a lot of other things. You know, they sell home goods, they sell beer making supplies, they sell things that aren't alcohol, but they have alcohol as an important component mix for their product, for their component mix. And I just feel like putting an arbitrary standard over, I don't think fresh food should be the standard, while we would certainly like to see more fresh food in some of our stores. And I also think of a place like that that's only maybe a couple thousand square feet. It's an important reuse of a building within a vibrant neighborhood, and mandating that it be 5,000 square feet seems a little arbitrary to me. I do like the 2% cooler thing a lot. I think that's great. You said if we have a pattern of use, if 2% is the standard, that's equivalent to what, one cooler door? 2 cooler doors at the most. That seems pretty minimal impact, especially when it's just beer and wine. And I think I'd be okay with, you know, the proximity to a school or a city-owned park. That seems acceptable.
But just to clarify, it's not that that would be required. It's just that, like looking at gross floor area, I just want to make sure I'm clear. It's that if it's less than that, you just have to go through a different process that allows for additional feedback from the community.
Yeah, and I think my question on, or my concern on some of that, we want to codify some things as administrative approved. So I like that we're working towards that in some circumstances. I just don't want to hey, I meet all the criteria for. If we put 10 criteria out there and then I hit 8 of them, and I'm like, well, darn it, I don't have 33% fresh food, but I've hit all the other check boxes. I don't want to make it too burdensome. Yeah. So we just want to make sure and then I have to go to get a special land use just because I have 36% beer and wine, right? Just want to be logical about this. I don't want to trigger a special land use in some circumstance just because of some arbitrary threshold that we set. Mm-hmm. So just trying to find a balance here.
Yeah, maybe Suzanne could speak about how she came up with these thresholds, but let's hear from Commissioner Schaefer and then Kelly.
Along those lines, I just have a question. Would I have to meet all of them to get administratively approved? And I think my question around that is that, some of these are going to conflict. I know you spoke about the fact that gross floor area would get to my grocery store, but then a lot of those are open beyond midnight, so now I'm knocked out of the box. Am I knocked out of the box if I don't meet all, or help me understand that? Because that doesn't seem logical, to me. But help me.
We can really draft it however you want. What we could do is say there's some absolutes. So if hours of operation are an absolute, that always has to be the case. We can write it like that. And then if you felt like, if it's a combination of some of these, maybe they can't meet all of them, but you've nearly hit everything. Mm-hmm. We could say, if you meet 2 or more or 3 or more of the following, then that. So I think we could write it in a couple of different ways, that either these are the absolutes or they're all absolutes, or if you meet so many of these that you can. Okay. You could be approved. So that might be a different approach to do it. I would recommend that hours of operation be really consistent, because from an enforcement standpoint and just consistency standpoint with how we're treating businesses, that to me is the easiest one to just say, here's that threshold. And from a neighbor perspective, hours of operation seem to be the greatest concern. For the other ones, I think you could probably do a combination where you pick a couple, and if they meet it, then it's.
Or if gross floor area is above 20,000 or something around that nature. I'm just trying to think about making it, because I really like where we're going in terms of making some things just administratively approved, which takes someone to look at it with expertise, and then that based on what we've approved in the past, and the secondary wave is those that go outside of those bounds, what maybe haven't approved or have approved with thoughtful discussion and feedback, and that allows for those. So I really appreciate the work you put into it.
Okay, so Commissioners, one thing here, we have one more resolution before us, and I want to be really mindful of public safety because we have community members joining us. So maybe I can talk about process, which I probably should have known ahead of time. I think the intent today was to see if there was overall support for this type of process moving forward, to identify what's administrative, what's special land use, what needs to go to BZA. And so it sounds like, from what I'm hearing, is that we are all supportive of moving forward with delineating the process and having some clear guidelines that meet the needs and hopefully the concerns of the neighbors, but also provides greater direction. It sounds like there's also support to move forward on some type of good neighbor plan. So for process-wise, City Manager, my thought is if Suzanne can take some of the feedback, if we can provide additional feedback on the areas that we want more information on, like how did you come up with this number? Is it arbitrary or is it based on something that we're not aware of? If you can work on that, and then if we can get this on the agenda on our January 9th meeting, that then we can have a greater conversation as well as vote on it at that time. Does that sound, process-wise, help me understand what's next steps?
You want her to bring what would be a final recommendation from her on all of these items? Some of them may not be included, some of them may have different numbers. Is that what you're suggesting?
What I'm suggesting is for the ones that you've heard concerns about,
Yes.
with the gross floor area, the 33%, help us understand where those numbers came from and why that is the logical threshold. Maybe it's because of past decisions. I don't know. I feel like we don't have enough time today to delve into that. But if commissioners can provide additional questions to Suzanne, if you want additional information, and then it sounds like we want to look at the potential of adding a good neighbor plan into the process. Then we can bring that forward at our January 9th meeting.
Yeah. And it would be a presentation for discussion to make sure that it's in the proper direction, because it has to go to the Planning Commission because it's an amendment to the zoning ordinance.
Okay.
For public hearing. Greg's looking at me. And then it'll come back to you for a vote.
Okay.
So I can also work with the Planning Commission too. So we'll have the discussion at your January 9th meeting, and then the Planning Commission meets that following Thursday. So then we can introduce it to them with the scheduled public hearing. So
okay.
we could do that as well.
Does that sound like a good plan, commissioners?
Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah.
Yes?
Just a couple questions that I think that we all need to know. You've got under evaluation considerations under the alcohol sales review standards, B, that whole piece about what sounds like a boutique store, and to clarify that information for us, because it sounds like there are some current considerations for ethnic foods, imported foods, and so on. And I know that for clarification for the business community, I like the administrative approval. It's just those few sticking points that we need more information on.
Yep. And then I think the most beneficial thing for me, if you have an opportunity to respond back, if there's anything in that far right-hand column, really Board of Zoning Appeals is the last resort. If it's generally prohibited. So if you feel strongly about anything to prohibit, or for example, if you want to keep that half-mile rule, if you want to say, avoid concentration of so many stores within a quarter mile, if you feel strongly about any of those, that would be very helpful for me to know, just because then I know kind of what the other end is. So I've got the administrative end. I feel like I have a good understanding of that. What you absolutely don't want to see happen would be helpful on the other end.
Okay. So commissioners, please, maybe in the next week, get that feedback to Suzanne. We will then expect this on our agenda at COW on the 9th, and then it'll be on the agenda for the Planning Commission on the 12th. And then we'll move forward with this. Okay? And Suzanne, maybe you can flesh out what a good neighbor plan would look like for our community as well, and present a recommendation for that.
Yep, we can do that.
Okay, are we good?
Great.
All right, so
Thank you.
I'm going to move us along to the next resolution, and then I'm going to hold off on the update of next step to our next meeting, but I'll ask James to send information to all of you electronically on that, so that you have that update electronically, and then we can talk about it at our next meeting. So James, so sorry about that.
Mayor, I will say that I feel like that update is pertinent for me for the discussion that we're planning to have later this evening.
Okay, that's a very good point.
But I don't know.
I wonder if we can add that update tonight to our evening meeting?
If James can make it, we can. Mr. Hurd?
Can we add, because we have an item before us tonight where we'll be talking about this, can you come to our evening meeting and give an update at the beginning of COW? Okay.
Thank you.
All right. All right, good. Okay.
Thank you.
All right, so resolution before us, this is a resolution authorizing staff to proceed with next steps in exploring the potential of a development of a parking and mixed-use facility at 111 Library Street Northeast.
So moved.
Support.
All right, Josh Nairmore, you want to tell us about this? And I know that this was on the agenda at our Mobile GR Commission, and so you want to fill us in on this, and then I'll let Commissioner Kelly weigh in before we call the question and see if there's any other questions.
Thanks, Mayor and Commissioners. So this morning, based on the discussion and feedback from the Mobile GR Commission at last Thursday morning meetings, we're bringing forward a resolution today to support moving forward with some of the next steps to develop a potential parking project at the Ryerson Library site. So this morning, just want to kind of hit some highlights and then have Eric add in a few pieces as well before turning it over to Commissioner Kelly. As you're aware, there's been a lot of conversation in my almost 2 years here now at the city related to some of the challenges related to parking, as well as last Tuesday night's discussion related to the parking resolution. So I wanted to just kind of highlight some things that, although it continues to be an issue, there's also a lot of work that staff has been working on with the commission and with a lot of the community business holders throughout Grand Rapids. So we debuted a new surface parking lot, part of a public-private partnership across from the downtown market last week. So that's construction of a new 300-space surface parking lot facility. In addition to that, in August of this year.
Josh, and can you just also add how much money we've invested? Because that lot was, what, $2 million that we invested?
Yes, it's $2 million in capital costs associated with that, and it's on private property, and then the city will be reimbursed as part of the lease agreement through the revenues generated until we break even and recoup the capital costs for the expenditure. In addition to that, in August, the City Commission approved a development agreement for the redevelopment of the surface parking lots known as Area 4 and 5 behind the Van Andel Arena, which is a net increase of which the city will be able to offer 300 parking cards for public monthly parking. So those projects, in addition to many improvements we've made to the analytics of the system and how we operate it, as well as some new permit parking for on-street and North Monroe, we've added hundreds of additional spaces to the system as well. So there's a lot of work that's been doing on that. In addition, we've been trying to look for additional ways in which we can expand the parking supply, whether that's for moving some of the monthly employees from different facilities or providing just general expansion to the system. So overall, we have included in your packet, without going through all of them, there are 4 different concepts at a very high level of which we were looking for. And then we spent a lot of time talking with the Mobile GR Commission about potential ways in which we could evaluate this project. A lot of the discussion centered on the financial feasibility associated with the project, as well as keeping in the context sensitivity to the surrounding district, the historic architecture of the library, as well as maintaining the integrity of the current library operations so that we don't impact negatively the existing employees and the patrons of the library, and acknowledging that. And a lot of discussion about improvements and continuing to include more public space in that area to try to activate it additionally. So that's at a very high level some of the overviews, and I want to turn it over to Eric to add some additional points.
Thank you, Josh. The review at the Parking Commission or Mobile GR Commission went very well last Thursday, and ultimately it was approved. The recommendation was approved unanimously. Part of the reasons I think were that this is about parking supply now to help continue to do our work with public-private partners to have our downtown business and our regional business center keep growing. This is a way to provide replacement parking supply as ramps age out. So we have a couple of older ramps that still have a good long life, but we need to think ahead. And those would be the Campaw ramp and the Pearl Ionia ramp. Both are they are the oldest in our inventory. We're also, with this investment, would be building into an emerging area. So when you look at what's happening around CC, the library, the new Veterans Park, surface lots on Fulton that are currently used for parking, that could be development sites. There is lots of potential in this area, and there's also there's a nightlife there that has to do with St. Cecilia's and the Civic Theater, and actually people park there and walk downtown for events. So there is lots of potential in this neighborhood. would develop and deliver this project through a public-private partnership. So it could be a sale and leaseback and then repurchase. There are a number of ways to manage this project and to deliver it. And we have a lot of partners who are capable of doing that. Also would allow us to rebalance parking supply. So, for example, people who are parking south of Fulton, many of whom could be our employees, could be relocated to this site, and that would create space where we now have a deficit of space south of Fulton. So there's a way to rebalance parking supply through the system. And really, this is about what we're going to do to help keeping economic development going forward. So the next steps, as Josh talked about, would be for you to authorize us to move forward. We'd prepare the site for redevelopment. We'd come back to you with criteria, process, method, and would do some work on the concepts, probably do an appraisal, and be ready to go.
And process-wise, Eric, that this resolution today would have us move forward to do due diligence, and then before it came back for final approval for us, it would go back before the Mobile GR Commission,
Absolutely.
correct? I just want to make sure we're all really clear about process,
Yep.
and that we honor and respect the process we have in place.
Right. And we talked about also as part of that process, there's a stakeholder group that Josh is engaged with that involves the Grand Rapids Chamber and a number of others. That would be a good place to stop. And we also have committed to working closely with the library in terms of how this is developed and have them be a partner on the design process, and in the development process.
Okay, great. I think I'll turn it to Commissioner Kelly, and then I'll see if there's any questions or comments, and I'll call the questions so that we can get down to public safety. Commissioner?
Thank you. I thought, too, it was a very good meeting. Lots of good information out there and exciting options that the Mobile GR Commission was interested in. I did see Jim Botts there, who's on the library board, and I know they were appreciative that we are considering the historic value of that building and all the investment that recently went into it. So we want to make sure that we honor that and create a site there that does not hide that beautiful building and also accommodates both their patrons and their staff. We had some comments at the end about the potential of car share, and that is something that I'm hoping that we can continue to look at, as well as our continued search for surface lots in the downtown area to accommodate the temporary needs while something like this is being built. So exciting options ahead, I think, and one of the things I think we need to consider when we are looking at our lots is thinking about the future and creating space for car share, creating space for accommodations for perhaps bike repairs and all that sort of thing, so that we really are looking at all those options. Peter Varga, who had his last date there, also reminded us, don't forget about all those mobility options, and he liked the fact that this was so close to the Silver Line stops. So excited about this going forward.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for your service on the Mobile GR Commission. You've been serving for several years, and I know you've been really actively involved in a lot of these conversations. All right, Commissioners, any final questions or comments? Commissioner Schaefer, you want to say anything?
Thank you for the proposal. It's nice to see it. So, and again, looking at it with ROI, there's things in there, but I'll just reserve my comments for later. So thank you.
Yeah. All right, anything else, Commissioners? All right, I will add my thanks to city staff who have worked really hard on this. Appreciate all your time and energy. All right, with that, I'll call the question. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? It carries. All right, we will adjourn, Commissioners. We have public safety downstairs, and we will immediately get that started.